Girl complained her eyes were itchy. Optometrist zoomed in and froze. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ellie had always been a curious and active child, but in recent weeks, her usual enthusiasm had been dampened by a constant discomfort she couldn't shake. For a while, her parents, Sarah and Ben, assumed it was just a seasonal allergy or perhaps a minor irritation from too much screen time. Ellie had begun rubbing her eyes more frequently, an action so repetitive that it seemed almost like a nervous tic. At first, it didn't seem too alarming, but as the days went by, the frequency of the rubbing increased, and Ellie started to complain more about the itchiness. "My eyes feel like there's something in them," Ellie would say, her voice filled with frustration, but there was no sign of foreign debris on her eyes when they checked. Still, her parents decided to schedule an appointment with Dr. Kate Robertson, a well-respected optometrist in their area, just to be safe. The appointment was set for the following week at Dr. Robertson's clinic in Los Angeles, a bright, modern facility known for its thorough care and advanced diagnostic equipment. Ellie was a little apprehensive, but her parents reassured her that it was just a routine visit. Upon entering the clinic, they were greeted warmly by the staff, and after filling out the necessary paperwork, they were quickly ushered into one of the exam rooms. Dr. Robertson, a seasoned professional with years of experience, greeted the family with a friendly smile. She immediately put Ellie at ease, engaging her in light conversation to make her feel comfortable. Ellie was a little fidgety during the initial exam, but Dr. Robertson was patient, guiding her through a series of basic vision tests. Ellie's eyes, despite the discomfort, were functioning normally in terms of focus and acuity. Dr. Robertson couldn't find any obvious signs of irritation, no redness, swelling, or visible scratches on the cornea. The optometrist then turned to a more detailed examination, asking Ellie to sit in front of a slit lamp, a device that would allow her to look deeper into Ellie's eyes. As Dr. Robertson adjusted the machine and asked Ellie to look straight ahead, she began to study the inside of Ellie's eye more closely. At first, everything seemed normal. The cornea was clear, the lens appeared healthy, and the retina was free from any signs of disease. But then, as Dr. Robertson magnified the view and adjusted the focus, something unusual caught her eye, a tiny movement within the pupil. It was subtle at first, but as she zoomed in further, the movement became more pronounced. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. There, within Ellie's eye, were small, wriggling shapes, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. The shapes seemed to dart around erratically, as if they were alive. Dr. Robertson's fingers froze on the controls. She had seen many things in her career, but this was beyond anything she had ever encountered. Her heart rate quickened as she focused the microscope even more, trying to discern exactly what these shapes were. As she zoomed in further, the shapes became clearer. They were not just moving randomly, they were larvae, their translucent bodies wriggling in the fluid of Ellie's eye. Dr. Robertson felt a cold chill run down her spine as she realized what she was looking at. She quickly pulled her head away from the slit lamp and turned to Ellie, her voice calm but firm. "Ellie, I need you to keep your eyes very still for a moment," she said, trying to mask the growing concern in her voice. "I'm going to take a closer look." Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Larvae in a human eye? It was unheard of. But the evidence was clear. Whatever these creatures were, they were alive, and they were inside Ellie's eye. The presence of these foreign organisms immediately triggered a flood of alarms in Dr. Robertson's mind. How had they gotten there? What kind of threat did they pose to Ellie's health? She knew she had to act quickly. She gently excused herself from the room, leaving Ellie with her parents, who were oblivious to the unfolding discovery. In the hallway, Dr. Robertson quickly called for a colleague, Dr. Martin, who specialized in ocular health and infectious diseases. She needed a second opinion, and she needed it fast. Within moments, Dr. Martin arrived at her side, and together they returned to Ellie's exam room. As they both peered through the slit lamp, Dr. Martin's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as he saw the larvae squirming in Ellie's eye. "What in the world?" he muttered under his breath. He was equally baffled by the situation, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary infection or irritation. The larvae were alive and active in Ellie's eye, and that was something they needed to address immediately. Dr. Robertson and Dr. Martin exchanged worried glances before taking the next step. They had to remove the larvae, but they couldn't risk causing Ellie any harm or further distress. The clinic, though well-equipped for most routine eye care, wasn't set up to handle a case like this, and it was clear that they would need to take drastic measures. Dr. Robertson immediately contacted the nearest hospital with an ophthalmology department, explaining the situation and requesting an emergency transfer. As she waited for a response, she instructed the clinic staff to prepare the necessary equipment for the larvae extraction procedure. In the meantime, Ellie's parents had become increasingly concerned. Sarah, who had been quietly observing the exam, could no longer sit in silence. "What's going on? Why isn't she coming back?" she asked, her voice rising with worry. Dr. Robertson, doing her best to remain calm, gently explained that they had found something in Ellie's eye, something that needed immediate attention. She avoided using words like larvae or infestation, but her tone was enough to convey the gravity of the situation. Ellie's parents were understandably shocked, unable to comprehend how their healthy, vibrant daughter could have something so disturbing happening to her. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. As Ellie's parents were ushered into a separate waiting room, the staff began preparing the necessary equipment. The situation had become dire. The clinic had gone into a sort of lockdown. No one was allowed to enter or exit without clearance. The emergency procedure to remove the larvae would take place in a sterile environment, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency. No one had ever dealt with a case like this before, and the medical staff were working on the fly, hoping their training and experience would guide them through the unknown. Dr. Robertson, now in the eye clinic's back room with Ellie, was forced to keep her emotions in check. She couldn't afford to let fear cloud her judgment. Her mind raced through the possibilities. How had this happened? What did it mean for Ellie's health? And, most disturbingly, how had the larvae gotten into her eye in the first place? The answer came swiftly and horrifyingly. Ellie had recently been given a cosmetic product, a cheap, unregulated mascara that her friend's older sister had purchased online. The product had been advertised as an all-natural, organic alternative to mainstream makeup brands, but the reality was far different. The mascara, it seemed, had been contaminated with something far worse than just harmful chemicals. It had been tainted with larvae, microscopic organisms that had found their way into Ellie's eye when she applied the mascara. The mascara was a counterfeit product, sold under a brand name that had no regulatory oversight, and it had caused a disaster for Ellie's eye health. Dr. Robertson felt a pang of horror as the realization set in. This wasn't just a case of poor hygiene or a simple allergic reaction. This was the result of an illegal cosmetic product, one that had been distributed without any regard for the safety of consumers. Ellie's condition was a direct result of a dangerous, unregulated industry that prioritized profits over people's health. And now, Ellie was the one who would suffer the consequences. The clinic, which had once been a place of routine care and comfort, had now become a battlefield. The medical team was in crisis mode, preparing to remove the larvae and save Ellie's eyesight before it was too late. Meanwhile, Dr. Robertson worked quickly to notify the authorities about the illegal product and its devastating effects, hoping that others could be spared from the same fate. The ordeal that had begun with something as simple as itchy eyes had now become a fight for Ellie's health, and the clinic's lockdown was just the beginning of a much larger investigation into the safety of cosmetic products in the black market. The clinic had gone from a routine medical setting to a chaotic emergency operation in a matter of minutes. Dr. Robertson stood at the head of the examination room, trying to maintain an air of calm professionalism, but even she couldn't hide the rising tension. She had just made a discovery that she couldn't have anticipated, an infestation of larvae living within an 8-year-old girl's eye. As the severity of the situation set in, she knew the next step had to be immediate action. She called Dr. Martin, who had arrived moments earlier, to join her in the examination. The two doctors exchanged worried glances before turning to Ellie, whose wide, innocent eyes seemed to reflect confusion rather than fear. Despite the sight of something foreign wriggling in her delicate eye, Ellie hadn't seemed to grasp the gravity of what was happening to her. Dr. Robertson tried to keep her voice steady as she explained to Ellie's parents that there was no time to waste. The larvae inside her eye had to be removed immediately before they could cause lasting damage. Ellie's parents, who had been sitting in the waiting room, barely processed the gravity of the situation. Ben, Ellie's father, paced back and forth, his mind racing. Sarah, on the other hand, was struggling to remain composed, asking the same questions over and over again. How did this happen? What are they doing to my daughter? Is she going to be okay? Dr. Robertson had no answers, not fully. She couldn't explain how these larvae had ended up in Ellie's eye, only that they had to be removed to prevent further harm. As she and Dr. Martin made arrangements to transport Ellie to the hospital for a more extensive procedure, the rest of the staff at the clinic began their own coordinated efforts. The clinic was going into lockdown. No one could leave or enter without proper clearance. Word of the situation was already spreading quickly, and the authorities had to be notified immediately. Ellie's parents were in shock, unable to believe that something like this could happen in such a sterile, professional setting. They had taken every precaution to ensure that Ellie's health was always a priority, so how could this have happened? It wasn't until Dr. Robertson, now standing beside them, gently explained that the mascara Ellie had recently used, an inexpensive brand that her friend's older sister had purchased online, was the likely culprit. The mascara, sold under the guise of being all-natural and organic, had proven to be anything but safe. Dr. Robertson's voice was low and urgent as she spoke. This mascara, it wasn't just poorly made, it was likely contaminated with something far worse. The larvae inside Ellie's eye weren't some accident. They came from a product that should never have been allowed on the market. It's a black market cosmetic that we're dealing with, and it's far from the only one. The truth hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Their daughter, their precious Ellie, had been exposed to something deadly because of a cheap, unregulated product sold online. The mascara wasn't the only issue, it was just one of many counterfeit items making their way into the consumer market, free from regulation and oversight. Ellie had fallen victim to something far beyond her control. In the emergency room, the team of ophthalmologists had begun to assess the situation more thoroughly. Ellie was prepped for a surgical procedure that, in any other circumstance, would have been considered routine for a severe eye infection or irritation. But this wasn't just an infection, it was an invasion. The larvae, no larger than a grain of rice, had embedded themselves in the tissue of her cornea and had begun to migrate deeper into her eye. The surgical team moved quickly, their experienced hands working in unison to remove the larvae without causing damage to Ellie's eye structure. Ellie lay still on the operating table, the anesthesia keeping her unconscious throughout the procedure, her face a picture of innocence as the team worked to rectify the horror that had unfolded in her body. The process was delicate. The larvae, despite their small size, had burrowed into the delicate tissue of her eye, attaching themselves with an almost unsettling persistence. The surgical team had to take extreme caution not to cause any additional trauma, as even the smallest misstep could result in permanent damage to Ellie's vision. Back at the clinic, the team was already gearing up for the next phase, addressing the root cause of the infestation. The mascara, which had been the catalyst for this entire ordeal, had now become the central point of an ongoing investigation. Dr. Robertson, who had seen her fair share of unusual cases over the years, couldn't help but feel a sense of outrage. The cosmetic industry had become a breeding ground for dangerous, unregulated products. The mascara that had caused Ellie's infection wasn't an isolated incident. It was just one of many products flooding the market without proper safety checks. The more Dr. Robertson thought about it, the more she realized how little control consumers had over what they put on their skin, let alone near their eyes. It wasn't just an issue of poor quality, it was a matter of public safety. Something had to be done. The lockdown at the clinic wasn't just about Ellie anymore. The authorities needed to be notified about the larger issue at hand, the growing black market cosmetic industry. The implications were far-reaching. If Ellie's mascara had contained larvae, what else could be lurking in other counterfeit products? The list of potential dangers seemed endless. It wasn't long before Dr. Robertson reached out to the Los Angeles Health Department, and soon, a small army of investigators arrived at the clinic, eager to understand the scope of the problem. It was clear that this wasn't just a random occurrence. The mascara Ellie had used was part of a larger network of illegally produced and distributed cosmetic products that bypassed the necessary testing and regulation. As Ellie's surgery proceeded, her parents sat in the sterile waiting room, unable to speak, their minds reeling with questions. How could they have known? How could anyone have warned them? The mascara had seemed harmless enough, an innocent gift from a friend's older sibling. But now, as Ellie's recovery was underway, they realized that what had seemed like a small, inconsequential product had turned out to be the catalyst for a terrifying medical crisis. They had no way of knowing how many others might have been exposed to similar dangers. As the hours passed and Ellie's surgery came to an end, the relief was palpable. Ellie's eye had been successfully cleaned, and the larvae were removed without causing any significant long-term damage. Ellie would recover, but her parents were left with an overwhelming sense of guilt and helplessness. Dr. Robertson's call to action didn't stop with Ellie's treatment. She became a driving force in an investigation that would eventually see multiple counterfeit cosmetic products removed from circulation. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this problem was much larger than anyone had initially realized. Ellie's case was just the beginning. What had started as an isolated medical emergency had now become a public health crisis. The evidence was mounting that the illegal trade of unregulated cosmetics was widespread, and it was only a matter of time before more victims came forward. For Ellie, her recovery would eventually allow her to return to her normal life, but the trauma of what had happened would stay with her and her parents forever. The clinic, once a place of routine eye exams, would forever be linked to the haunting discovery of the tiny creatures that had invaded her body. Ellie's story, in all its horrifying details, would serve as a warning to others about the dangers lurking in the shadows of the beauty industry. As the investigation into the counterfeit cosmetic products intensified, the consequences of the discovery at Dr. Robertson's clinic began to ripple far beyond the confines of the small office in Los Angeles. The news spread quickly across local news outlets and eventually made its way to national headlines. The shocking nature of what had happened to Ellie, an innocent 8-year-old girl, struck a chord with the public, and a wave of concerned parents and eye care professionals rallied behind the cause, demanding better oversight and regulation of beauty products. Dr. Robertson, who had once been a trusted figure in her community for routine eye exams, now found herself thrust into the spotlight, her clinic at the center of a growing controversy. Despite her discomfort with the newfound attention, she knew that her role was far from over. She had uncovered something far more insidious than a single incident of an infected eye. She had stumbled upon an underground market of dangerous, unregulated beauty products that could be harming countless others. The significance of the problem became more apparent as the investigation uncovered the true scale of the illicit trade. Dr. Robertson, along with local health authorities, began to piece together the vast network responsible for the distribution of these counterfeit cosmetics. The mascara that Ellie had used was just one example of a much larger operation, one that spanned multiple cities, operating in the shadows of the legitimate beauty industry. What had seemed like a harmless product, marketed as natural and organic, turned out to be a product that had been deliberately tainted with dangerous materials. Worse still, there was evidence to suggest that this was not an isolated issue. Counterfeit cosmetics laced with toxic chemicals, bacteria, and even parasitic larvae were being sold to consumers, primarily online, where regulatory oversight was nearly non-existent. The more Dr. Robertson learned, the angrier she became, realizing how easy it was for such harmful products to slip through the cracks of the system. She had spent years advocating for the safety and well-being of her patients, but this situation exposed just how vulnerable the public was to the hidden dangers of an unregulated market. As the investigation progressed, the authorities managed to trace the origins of the infected mascara back to a warehouse located in a part of Los Angeles notorious for illegal trade. The warehouse was linked to several sellers who had flooded the market with counterfeit beauty products, often marketed with glowing, deceptive reviews from influencers and fake testimonials that had convinced consumers to purchase them without question. The mascara that had caused Ellie's eye infestation was just one of hundreds of similar products being distributed under different names. The investigation uncovered that these products were being manufactured in unsanitary conditions, with little regard for the safety of the end users. What was even more disturbing was the discovery that the cosmetics were being packaged and sold with no real understanding of the ingredients being used, making it nearly impossible to know what contaminants were lurking inside. The people responsible for this network of counterfeit goods were not only breaking the law, they were endangering lives in ways that few could have imagined. For Ellie and her parents, the ordeal was far from over. Though Ellie's eye had been treated successfully, the emotional and psychological impact of the experience lingered far longer than anyone had anticipated. The trauma of knowing that something so foreign and dangerous had been introduced into her body was something that Ellie would struggle to understand for years to come. For Sarah and Ben, the guilt and helplessness were overwhelming. They had been responsible for ensuring their daughter's safety, and yet they had unwittingly exposed her to a product that had nearly cost her vision and her well-being. No amount of reassurance from Dr. Robertson or other medical professionals could fully alleviate the weight of that guilt. They tried to remain strong for Ellie, but as parents, they couldn't help but feel that they had failed her. Every time they looked at their daughter, they saw the pain and confusion in her eyes, and it hurt them more than they could express. The process of healing would take time, not just physically, but emotionally for the entire family. Ellie, despite the physical healing of her eye, began to display signs of anxiety and fear that hadn't been there before. She was reluctant to touch anything that came near her face, and the sight of any cosmetic product, even something as simple as a bottle of shampoo, would send her into a state of unease. Her parents tried to comfort her, reassuring her that she was safe and that she had nothing to fear, but Ellie's mind struggled to shake the terrifying images of the larvae that had once wriggled inside her eye. She had nightmares about bugs crawling inside her again, waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to escape the vivid images of her ordeal. Her teachers and friends noticed the changes in her behavior, and though she tried to hide it, it was clear that the emotional toll of what had happened was taking its toll. Sarah and Ben knew that they would need to get her the emotional support she needed to help her process the trauma, but it was a journey that would take time, patience, and understanding. Meanwhile, Dr. Robertson and her colleagues worked tirelessly to ensure that no other patient would have to go through what Ellie had experienced. The attention that had been brought to the issue of counterfeit cosmetics was not just about one product, it was about a larger movement to ensure that safety standards were implemented across the industry. Dr. Robertson became an advocate for better regulation and for stricter penalties for those involved in the sale of harmful cosmetics. She began speaking out in public forums, educating consumers about the risks of purchasing beauty products from unverified sources and encouraging lawmakers to take action against the proliferation of counterfeit goods. Her clinic became a focal point for community outreach and education, with Dr. Robertson personally leading efforts to inform the public about the dangers of unregulated beauty products. She wasn't just a doctor anymore, she had become an activist, a voice in the fight to protect the public from unscrupulous vendors who put profit above safety. In the months that followed, more cases began to surface. Other people came forward with similar stories, victims who had unknowingly used tainted products and suffered adverse effects as a result. Some had experienced eye infections, while others had developed rashes, swelling, and allergic reactions. The CDC launched a nationwide investigation into the sale of counterfeit cosmetics, with several major cities becoming the focus of their efforts. The investigation revealed a staggering number of unsafe products that had infiltrated the market, many of which had been sold to consumers without any regard for their safety. As the public became more aware of the dangers, the demand for greater regulation grew stronger. Consumers began to hold brands and retailers accountable for the products they sold, pushing for greater transparency and accountability within the beauty industry. Ellie's experience, though traumatic, became a catalyst for change. Her story resonated with countless others who had been unknowingly exposed to the risks of unregulated cosmetics, and it sparked a broader conversation about the need for stricter safety measures in the beauty industry. The investigation, the media coverage, and the public outcry all contributed to a movement that pushed for greater oversight and better consumer protection. In the end, Ellie's ordeal served as a painful reminder of just how vulnerable people were to the hidden dangers that existed in everyday products. While the road to healing was long for Ellie and her family, they found solace in knowing that their daughter's experience had played a significant role in raising awareness and making the world a safer place for others. As weeks passed, the investigation into the counterfeit cosmetics continued to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. The story of Ellie's terrifying encounter with the larvae in her eye had not only shocked the public but had ignited a call to action that spread across social media, through news outlets, and into legislative chambers. Dr. Robertson's clinic had transformed from a small, quiet practice into the focal point of a larger movement, one that aimed to bring about significant reform in the cosmetic industry. Ellie's case was the spark that set everything in motion, but it was clear that the real work had only just begun. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident of a child suffering from an unusual infection was now part of a much broader conversation about consumer safety, regulatory oversight, and the increasingly dangerous world of counterfeit beauty products. Ellie's recovery, though physically successful, was slow. Her eye had healed well enough that her vision was restored, and the invasive larvae had been completely removed without lasting damage. However, the psychological toll the incident had taken on her was far more profound. The nightmares continued, and she found herself unwilling to let anything near her face, even something as simple as her mother's touch or her own reflection in the mirror. Sarah and Ben could see the changes in their daughter, and while they knew time would be a crucial element in her healing, they also understood that professional help was needed. Ellie began attending counseling sessions, where she slowly began to confront the terror she had experienced. It was clear that Ellie was a resilient child. She had been through something unimaginable, and while the scars were invisible, they were there, lingering in the back of her mind. But over time, with the support of her family and therapists, Ellie started to make progress. She learned to trust again, to face her fears, and gradually, the world that had once seemed full of danger and unknown threats began to feel safe once more. For Sarah and Ben, the emotional toll was no less severe. As parents, the guilt they felt was almost overwhelming. They couldn't help but wonder how they had failed to protect their daughter from something so preventable. They questioned every decision they had made, every product they had allowed Ellie to use, and every choice that had led to her exposure to something so dangerous. But the truth was that they, like millions of others, had been victims of a system that was failing to protect its consumers. It was a system that allowed counterfeit cosmetics, often marketed as safe, organic alternatives, to flood the market unchecked. The mascara that had caused Ellie's suffering had been sold under the guise of an innocent, well-marketed product, and it had only been one of many similar items that were slipping through the cracks. Sarah and Ben came to understand that they were not to blame for Ellie's trauma, but they also knew that the fight to prevent others from experiencing the same thing would be a long and ongoing battle. Dr. Robertson, too, found herself grappling with the weight of the situation. Though she had done everything she could to help Ellie, the more she learned about the scale of the counterfeit cosmetic trade, the more she realized how little had been done to regulate the industry. She had always been passionate about eye care, but now her passion had expanded into advocacy. As Ellie's story continued to make headlines, Dr. Robertson began receiving calls from journalists, legislators, and even other doctors who were concerned about the rise of counterfeit products in the market. It was a wake-up call for everyone involved, and Dr. Robertson had a new sense of purpose, one that was focused not just on treating individual patients, but on preventing future tragedies like Ellie's. She started working with lawmakers, pushing for stricter regulations on beauty products and more rigorous testing to ensure that they were safe for use. She also began collaborating with consumer protection organizations, advocating for transparency in product labeling and stronger penalties for companies found selling counterfeit goods. The road to reform was long and filled with obstacles, but Dr. Robertson remained determined. She knew that Ellie's ordeal had ignited something much larger than herself or her clinic. It had sparked a movement that was destined to change the industry for the better. The authorities, too, had not remained idle. As the investigation into the origins of the contaminated mascara continued, it became clear that the scale of the operation was staggering. The fake mascara Ellie had used had been traced back to a network of sellers who were operating under the radar, producing and distributing thousands of counterfeit beauty products to consumers across the country. Law enforcement worked alongside the FDA and the Consumer Product Safety Commission to shut down the distribution channels. Raids were carried out at warehouses, and arrests were made. Some of the culprits had been involved in the illegal cosmetic trade for years, And the discovery of the larvae-infested mascara was just one example of the countless dangerous products that had been making their way into the market. Though some of the perpetrators were apprehended, there was still much to be done to stop the flow of counterfeit goods. The investigation revealed that the counterfeit industry was much larger than anyone had anticipated, and it was only with sustained effort that progress could be made. The story of Ellie and her eye infection became a rallying cry for consumer protection advocates, and it was clear that this battle was far from over. As time went on, the conversation around counterfeit cosmetics began to shift. Public awareness reached a fever pitch, with more and more people demanding safer products and stricter regulations. News outlets continued to cover the ongoing investigation, and the hashtag Ellie's Eyes began trending on social media, with people sharing their own stories of counterfeit beauty products. Some had suffered physical reactions, while others had encountered harmful side effects they hadn't realized were linked to the products they used. People who had once been unaware of the dangers now found themselves questioning the safety of the products they had trusted for years. The beauty industry, which had once been shrouded in glamour and allure, was now being scrutinized more closely than ever before. For Ellie, the journey toward healing wasn't just about her eye. It was about reclaiming her sense of safety and control. As she slowly regained her confidence, her parents, too, began to heal, knowing that they were no longer alone in their grief. The world around them had changed, and while Ellie would always carry the scars of her experience, there was hope in knowing that her suffering had led to something greater. She had become a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change, inspiring others to take a stand against the dangers of unregulated beauty products. And though the road ahead was still long, Ellie and her family found solace in knowing that they had been a part of something important, a movement that was dedicated to making the world a safer place for everyone, starting with the products we put on our skin.